Thanks for checking out the weekly sermon from Church of the Resurrection. I pray that God will use this message to speak to you and help you grow in your faith journey. If you're in the KC area, I'd like to invite you to join us next week at one of our services, or join us in live worship online at core.org/worship. Church of the Resurrection is one church in multiple locations. To learn more about the service times in our ministries, please visit core.org. Hope you enjoy this week's message. To honor all copyright restrictions, we have removed some video and audio elements from this message.
I'm Ann Williams. I'm one of the pastors here, and would you turn your attention to the reading of Scripture with us as we hear from Genesis 2. Therefore a man leaves his father and his mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. In Song of Songs, we read these words. Look at you, so beautiful, my dearest. Look at you, so beautiful, my love. You've captured my heart with one glance from your eyes. I belong to my lover, and my lover belongs to me. Set me as a seal over your heart, for love is as strong as death. And in Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians, we hear these words. God's will is that your lives are dedicated to him. This means that you stay away from sexual immorality and learn how to control your own body in a pure and respectable way. Don't be controlled by your sexual urges like the Gentiles who don't know God. No one should mistreat or take advantage of their brother or sister in this issue. May God add a blessing to the reading, hearing, and understanding of these words.
Hey, it's Kelly Ray Sunshine here. Who's ready to play?
I'm ready, Kelly Ray.
I know you are, beautiful Bill, and so are Brian and Leah, so come on up to the stage. Woo! Oh my goodness, you too. Look, you get to pick a coveted key that's going to open the door to a relationship for love that will last a lifetime. All you have to do is pick a door.
Okay. Do you want to pick?
No, you pick, babe.
Really? Are you sure?
Yes.
You're sure I can pick?
Great, yes.
Okay,
yes,
cool. I'd like door number 3.
Door number...
but not 3, though. 3. 3's like we don't do 3, though.
Okay.
But any of the doors
Okay, great.
Yes,
okay,
yes.
Door number 1.
Door number 1!
But you know, I'm scared of the number 1, so not 1 though. But any other choice, any other choice you pick. You pick.
What would you like to go with?
Door number 4?
4? Yes,
yeah.
You did it. Yes,
yeah, door 4.
Door number 4, Bill.
So Helen went to visit her old friend Ruth. They hadn't seen each other in years, and when she arrived at the house, she noticed that Ruth was so sweet to her husband. They'd been married 60 years, and she was calling him honey and dear and my love and all of these beautiful names. And when they had a moment alone, Helen said to Ruth, I just think it's amazing after 60 years how sweet you talk to your husband. You're just constantly calling him kind names. And she said, well, here's the truth. 10 years ago, I forgot his name, and I'm too afraid to ask the old crank what it is. Well, sometimes affection is practiced for maybe not the right reasons, but today we're going to talk about the 4th key to making relationships last a lifetime. And that key is affection and intimacy. Affection and intimacy. When it comes to affection, we're talking about every kind of relationship, not just romantic relationships, but every kind of relationship requires affection. So I think about when my granddaughter comes to visit, and she runs to me and jumps into my arms, and there's an affection that's there in the hug, in the embrace that we share. There's an affection that's needed with friends, with coworkers that you're connected to, with your parents or your siblings. We all need affection. We need to give affection. Now, you might give it in different ways than somebody else, but being able to speak kind words, tender words. And I think about, something as simple as kissing the boo-boo on our daughters when they were little and they skinned their knees. There was something happened in that moment where you just, you kissed them, you held them, they felt safe, they felt secure. There was something beautiful that happens in the sharing of affection. And the Apostle Paul says this, Paul and both Peter and Paul say this, that we should love one another with mutual affection, So this is true even in the church. Now, This week I was reading selections from a book that came out about 10 years ago by Cheryl Kirschenbaum, and the book is called The Science of Kissing. And in there, she had all kinds of interesting data about what happens when we kiss. And there was an interesting study she quoted. I'm going to read directly from her words. A 10-year psychology study undertaken in Germany during the 1980s found that men who kissed their wives before leaving for work lived on average 5 years longer, earning 20 to 30% more than peers who left without a peck goodbye. That's kind of interesting. I don't know if that's accurate or not. Still accurate. That was back in the 1980s, but there's a lot of studies out there that say that there's some benefit to showing affection regularly, and the kiss is really an important part of that. So neuroscientist Dr. Wendy Hill conducted tests in biochemistry in her laboratory by bringing in college students who'd been dating for at least 18 months. And so they came into her laboratory, and there was, I think, a romantic setting that was set up, and they were to kiss for 15 minutes. So, the college students really liked this makeout session, in the laboratory to be tested. And so what happened is they drew blood from them to begin with before they kissed, and then at the end of the 15 minutes, they drew blood again, and they wanted to see what changes happened in biochemistry as people were, quote, making out, as they were kissing together. And here's what she found. They focused on two particular hormones. One is oxytocin and the other one is cortisol. Oxytocin is the cuddle hormone. It's the bonding hormone that connects people together. And what she found, as you would expect, is that after they had kissed for 15 minutes, the level of oxytocin rose in their bloodstream. And this also gives a sort of euphoric feeling, a feeling not only of bonding with another person, but feeling a sense of general well-being. Cortisol, on the other hand, is the fight or flight drug. This is our hormone. This is what's meant to prepare us for a conflict or to keep us safe. And so it elevates our heart rate. It prepares us to fight or flight. It also elevates stress levels in the body. And what happened is after 15 minutes of sharing an intimate kiss, the levels of cortisol came down in the body. The lower levels of cortisol would indicate a healthier, a longer lifespan and greater health if you can reduce the amount of stress. And so this is part of what they found in this simple test that they had done in the laboratory. By the way, of course, as I mentioned, this isn't just in romantic relationships. Why is it that our granddaughter stops crying when we kiss her boo-boos when she skins her knee? Well, there's something that happens there in feeling safe, in feeling loved, and feeling like that gentle kiss is going to somehow make it all okay. I think about when I visited in the hospital. And so one of the tests they found was that even it wasn't only just kissing, it actually cortisol was reduced. The stress hormone was reduced when you were even holding hands. So it didn't require a kiss, even holding hands. Now, oxytocin required a little more than hand holding to see the elevated levels, but for the reduction of cortisol, just holding hands. And I thought about that when I go to visit somebody in the hospital who's preparing for surgery or somebody maybe who's dying, and what happens when I take their hand and I hold their hand, in that moment, and you can often see a reduction of stress on their face. You begin to see they're breathing easier just because there's someone there who's holding their hand. And so affection is really important in our lives. All right, and we think about the various forms of affection and how they do affect marital and romantic relationships. And a study was done of 100,000 people around the world. They found that people who rubbed one another's backs were happier in their marriages and felt, they felt safer and they felt more love. And people who held hands and people who kissed and all of these other things, they all found a positive result in their sense of happiness in their marriage. One of the challenges was that people under 35, they tend by a number of about 3/4, if they're in a romantic relationship, they tend to hold hands or demonstrate public affection. But those who are over 35 drops down to under 50% who are still doing these kind of simple things to make the other one feel loved, to make them feel safe. Now, a couple of weeks ago, one of our staff came out and interviewed Levon and me to talk about our experience of affection in our relationship. And this is what Levon and I had to say, what Levon had to say and how I responded. Take a listen.
I think we're pretty good about showing affection to one another, and the ways that we do that are, I don't think we ever leave without saying, I love you. I would say 90% of the time we're going to kiss each other goodbye, and when you get home, same type of thing, go to bed, I love you. We're going to spend a few minutes talking and recapping our day with each other when we connect again. We like to hold hands.
I think one of my favorite things is almost every morning when we wake up, we end up, cuddling together. She'll hold my hand or she'll come over and lay on my chest. And there's just something that,
Well, let me clarify that. It's not when we wake up. I will have already been awake for an hour, and then I will come back in and lay beside you and just kind of cuddle with you, because we are in a different sleep schedule.
We are in a different sleep schedule. I go to bed about 1 or 2 in the morning, and she goes to bed about
By 10.
By 10 o'clock at night. So when she's up at 6:30, I'm not ready to get up yet. But regardless of that, you do come back in, and that just
a way to connect.
Yeah,
it starts the day to connecting and talk about what our days hold.
Affection matters. Demonstrations of affection matter in all relationships, and certainly in marital and romantic relationships. This is one of the keys to making love, to making our relationships, our romantic relationships, last for a lifetime. So I think about that. We find it in the scriptures, and there's an entire book in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, called Song of Songs, or sometimes Song of Solomon. And presumably Solomon is the author, and his bride is sharing together in this back and forth. It's a book of epic poetry, and it's both romantic and at places we might even call it erotic poetry. And I want you to hear just one portion of it once more. So you hear the affection in the words, and so it's broken down by male and female. The man, presumably Solomon, says, "Look at you, so beautiful, my dearest." And the woman says, "Look at you, so beautiful, my love." And the man says, "You've captured my heart with one glance from your eyes." And she responds, "I belong to my lover, and my lover belongs to me." And then finally, she says, "Set me as a seal over your heart, for love is as strong as death." And what we find in that entire book is this affirmation, God's blessings upon affection and romantic affection, and that we need to speak that, we need to verbalize it as well as touch. And throughout the book, you'll find that there's plenty of examples of the touch, of one another and demonstrating romantic love, romantic affection. This is a really important key to making love last for a lifetime. So I want to shift gears and move from that to physical intimacy. And when we talk about physical intimacy, we tend to cringe a little bit in church. We tend to think, well, why are we talking about this here? But here's the problem. If we don't talk about it in the church, where are we talking about it? Where are we learning about it? We can learn the mechanics in sex ed in school. We can learn something about what this looks like, but also often false pictures when we're watching television or the movies or reading, fiction books. But where do we actually talk about the meaning and purpose of this if we're not talking about it at the church? Where do we talk about the ethics of this and the values of this if we're not talking about it in the church? And the problem isn't that the church talks too much about it. It's probably that the church hasn't talked about it enough. And so I want us to talk about physical intimacy for a few moments, because this is also a key to seeing relationships that last for a lifetime. All right, so one of the things that we tend to think is that, and somewhere we got along the way, maybe by what our parents taught us when we were growing up, or maybe we got it in the church, but that sex is a bad thing, that sexual intimacy is somehow dirty, it's tawdry, it's something not to be talked about, it's sinful. And yet God invented physical intimacy. Like, this is a gift from God. And so when we go back to Genesis chapter 2, we find these words, Genesis 2, 24 and 25. We find, therefore, a man leaves his father and his mother. And today it would say, therefore, a woman also leaves her father and mother, clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked, and they were not ashamed. This points to the purpose of physical intimacy. So we already recognize that the Bible begins with a marriage. The Bible begins with God creating two human beings for each other. And those human beings were created, we learned a few weeks ago, to be one another's helpers, one another's deliverers, and one another's companions. But here we're learning about physical intimacy, and the goal here is twofold. They're told to be fruitful and multiply. So of course, physical intimacy is about reproduction. That's one small part of it, but that's an essential part of it. All animals in the animal kingdom have this capacity for reproduction in this way. And when they do this, they're drawn to it because they were created by God to desire this at some point. Most animals are not falling in love and all of that. They're just mating. Every night at my pond in my backyard, I hear the sound of frogs, hundreds of them from the back porch as they're calling out mating calls to each other. This is just what we do as human beings. It's what we do as animals, as we find the longing to be together to reproduce. But it's not just about reproduction. And I would say it's not even primarily about reproduction. There comes a point in our lives where we're not going to be able to have children anymore. There are people who don't want to have children. There are people who can't have children. And yet they're still intimate. They still long for that. And so Genesis 2:24 captures the bigger idea, and that is they became one flesh. There is a union that happens here. There is a physicality, a physical union in the act of love, making love. But then beyond that, there is something that's binding the two together. So we talked a moment ago about oxytocin, which is a hormone that's meant to be, it's used for pair bonding. That's the impact it has on the brain, is it bonds you to another human being. And so we find that, we experience that in the act of physical intimacy, or at least, much of the time we do, we're meant to. That's part of the purpose, is to cement us together. It's to help us to be able to make our relationships last a lifetime. This is an important gift from God. It's a blessing from God. And so notice again, they became one flesh. And then they were both naked and they were not ashamed. There was nothing shameful about Adam and Eve being together. There was nothing shameful about being naked with one another. That was a beautiful gift from God. God looked on it and God said that it was good. So it's interesting, in our own lives, the scientists are telling us today all of the benefits to this kind of physical intimacy. So we find, and this is just a summary of some of the findings in science. So sexual intimacy among women increases recall more than doing crossword puzzles or playing memory games. One study found that regular intimacy stimulated cell growth in the hippocampus. It lowers stress levels like other types of affection. It reduces levels of cortisol. It produces increasing amounts of oxytocin, dopamine, and serotonin. It improves the immune system. It lowers blood pressure, and it can lead to a longer life. That's just a summary of some of the benefits of physical intimacy. This is a gift from God meant to bind us together. So the challenge is that sometimes we misuse the gift from God. Right? So we know they're good gifts God gives us. When we misuse them, they become things that are no longer gifts, they bring pain. And so I just want to remind you, in the Greek New Testament, the word for sin is hamartia. Hamartia, as we've learned, is an archery term. When you take a bow and arrow and you shoot, and that arrow goes flying forward, if it veers off the path, that's hamartia. It misses the mark. And oftentimes in our lives, because we have a sin nature, there's a part of us, there's a part of us that wants to do good and right, and there's another part of us that's drawn to doing the thing we're not supposed to do. Because we have that nature and we have a sex drive, we find that sometimes we veer off course. And when we do that, we sometimes get hurt. Other people get hurt. So it's not that God doesn't want us to enjoy our bodies. He doesn't want us to enjoy this part of life. He wants us to enjoy it, but he knows that if we veer off the course, we can find ourselves hurting each other or hurting ourselves. And so I think about this week. So last year, we excavated our pond at our house. We live on some acreage out in Stillwell. And we excavated the pond, and it's been filling back up again. And they took all the muck from the bottom of the pond because the fish were dying and there wasn't enough water in there. And so we took all that out and we spread it across the property. And now it's been drying for like 9 months, and it's time to plant seed out there. So the other day I was out planting seed with my tractor, my John Deere tractor, my broadcast spreader. And when I was done with that, then I hooked up the disc and I began to disc that, gently into the ground. And there was one section, and I thought, okay, I probably shouldn't go through that section because it seems like the ground's a little soft, but I thought, well, I can probably do that. And so instead of going around it the way I should have, I go right through this little soft section. And this is what happened. That's my John Deere 1964 3020 tractor, and I am so stuck in there that I had another tractor try to come pull me out, and he couldn't get me out either. And I'd love to disconnect the disc, but it's stuck now, wedged in there, and I got to have a super big tractor come and pull me out. And that's what happens when we end up missing the mark and we go on a path we're not supposed to go on, is sometimes we find ourselves stuck in the mud. And that's what happens when it comes to sexual intimacy, when we end up misusing it in a way that God does not intend. So how do we know the way that God wants us to intend it, wants us to use this? We might say, well, we'll just look in the Bible. Except for the Bible is kind of a mixed bag too. We find all kinds of things in the Hebrew Bible that were allowed that today we would say, no, that's not even healthy. That's not even good. Solomon had, hundreds of wives and then secondary wives or concubines, and nobody would say that's a good idea today. And there's a whole host of other things like that. And there are things in the Bible where you find, well, that's not supposed to be, but yet you find today we understand, science and humanity differently. And so we might go, well, maybe this is actually allowed, when in the Bible they didn't understand that. And so, yes, we look to the Bible, but what we look to in the Bible is its major themes. And here's a couple of big ideas that we would just start with. And one of those big ideas is that we are to love God, but we're also to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. And then Jesus said it this way a second time in the Golden Rule. He said, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And so when we think about this, we begin to ask the question, is what I'm considering, or is what somebody else is doing, is it loving? Does it express agape? Does it hurt people or does it bless them? Is it selfless or is it selfish? And so when we look at what's selfish and what hurts other people, we find something that God would say, that's not appropriate. That's not right. You're going to hurt that person. You're going to hurt yourself. And when we find that we exhibit or use our sexuality in a way that seriously harms somebody else, the wrath of God is invoked. We just got to understand that. So rape and incest and abusing people and misusing them and assault and using power in order to take what's not yours and not taking no for an answer and all of these other kinds of things. Listen, and I want to speak really clearly to the guys who are here, women too, but primarily to the guys. No means no. When you are thinking about taking something that doesn't belong to you and it's not freely given, that's absolutely inappropriate. When you are abusing or misusing your power and harming children, all of these things, the wrath of God is revealed against this kind of sin. We got to hear that and understand it. Right? Not only understand it, we got to live that. We're going to bring harm to ourselves and harm to other people. This is not okay. But I want to talk just a little bit about some of the more common things that happen. And the first one of those is what we find is the most frequently cited cause for divorce at Church of the Resurrection. And in our survey of 10,100 people, we had 900 divorced people. We said, what was the primary cause of your divorce? The number one answer, adultery, infidelity. Across the country, the number one answer to the question, what led to your divorce? Infidelity or adultery. So we asked the question here, this is a beautiful thing. We have this survey of data of over 10,000 people who we asked very serious questions, very intimate questions. It was all anonymous. And I wanted to share with you one piece of data. We asked, have you ever been unfaithful to your spouse with another person? So this isn't data from New York City or California. This is you. And so what we find is in their 20s, there were 6% of the people, men, who had been unfaithful, and 2% of women. And you see it continuing to rise. So in the 30s, there were 6% of men and about 3% of women. You get to the 40s and the number, again, this is cumulative. So, whatever I did in my 20s or 30s is add to whatever happens in their 40s. And so you find men in their 40s, roughly 9%, women roughly 6%. By the time you get to the 50s, if you add this all up cumulatively, you end up with about 13% of men and about 6% of women. 60s, that group or that generation, for some reason, a little lower than the guys in their 50s right now. But again, cumulatively, over 10% men, over 5% women. You get to the 70s and you find for men, it was over 13%. And for women, it was about 5%. The 80s, there was just so few in that category that I think that threw that off just a little bit. But what you see is that on average, there was about 10% of men across all ages and about 5% of women across all ages who took the survey from Resurrection, or those of you online or on TV, who had been unfaithful somewhere along the way. Listen, there's no judgment here about this except the fact that you know already and you have seen the harm that can cause, that does cause to other people. And so we recognize that as sin. Non-religious people recognize this is not okay because it hurts people. It brings pain. But here's the other thing. Along with recognizing that this is sin and brokenness, there's also grace and mercy. And it doesn't mean that your relationship necessarily will be healed, but it does mean that there's grace from God. And what I've often said is that there is not a single one of us put in the wrong set of circumstances at the wrong time in their lives who might not succumb to this temptation. So this is something that's very real in our lives. We've all had the moment of the maybe where we've wondered or we've thought about it. I have. I'm certain that you have. At some point along the way, there was somebody who made you feel special that wasn't your spouse, or maybe they were married to someone else. And so then we decide, do we act upon that or do we not act upon that? Now, you might think, well, that's a lot of people, 10% of men and 5% of women at Resurrection. But let me just tell you, national studies have shown that 15% of women, or at least 13%, so somewhere between 13 and 15% of women, and somewhere between 20 and 25% of men have cheated on their spouses. And so the numbers here at Resurrection are less than half of that. And part of what that points to is that religion plays a pivotal role. A deep faith plays a pivotal role as a safeguard against infidelity. It doesn't mean that, as we've learned, that religious people and deeply committed Christians don't violate this, but it means they do it at a lesser number or a lower level than people who don't have a strong faith in their lives. All right, that leads to a second area where we end up with questions and where there can be pain, and that's premarital sex. So this sounds so antiquated and Victorian when we talk about premarital sex as not being God's primary, best will for our lives, because so many people have done this. Although what we find now is that the numbers of people having premarital sex is going down and the number of people who are waiting longer is going up. And there are a lot of reasons sociologists think that's happening. But we might think, well, this is just impossible. Nobody can really do this. Well, I'm lifting up to you God's ideal. And without judgment, I'm just lifting up God's ideal. And I want to share with you just a little bit about why God's, best idea is that the first time that you share yourself completely with another human being is when you get married. And so here's the idea. In the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament, we both find the same euphemism is used for sexual intimacy, and that is to know. So Abraham knew his wife Sarah, and 9 months later, Jacob was born. And throughout the Bible, we find this idea of to know. In Hebrew, it's yada. In Greek, it's gnosko. And I love this because it really points to this idea of when you're finally naked before another person, you become completely vulnerable and you become known in a way that nobody else knows you. Nobody else, your neighbors, no one knows you this way. This is something special. It's something, unique. It's something that is a complete opening of yourself to another human being. And when that happens, of course, we bond to one another. So we've learned that oxytocin is released in the act of love and lovemaking. And so we bond to another person. The challenge, of course, at least in part when it comes to premarital sex, is we bond to one person. And we don't really mean much by that. You know, maybe a one-night stand, or maybe it does mean something to us. And then we pull apart from there and we bond with another person, and then another person, another person. And we've never made vows that we're going to love and cherish one another until we're parted by death. We're just enjoying that moment. And so we bond and break and bond and break and bond and break. And at some point, you begin to realize that maybe that bonding mechanism doesn't work the way it's supposed to work anymore, not quite the way it used to work. And one of the illustrations of this that I always use as a youth director with my teenagers in youth group is to take some really sticky tape, duct tape or something like it, and you take that tape, and it's basically acting as the bonding mechanism. Remember, marriage and intimacy, physical intimacy was about making two one, and so you've got this stickiness here, and then you bond it to something, like here, a piece of carpet, and it sticks. It holds pretty well. And then you peel that off, and of course you've got carpet fibers from this piece of carpet, and now it's time you're gonna bond to another, right? And it's still holding there. Not quite as strongly, but it's still holding, and so the mechanism still works. But now I got even more carpet that's bound to, the fibers that are bound to this, and I've left some adhesive over there, and I come to another piece, and I find it's not quite sticking, but there was some stickiness, but now I got some more of that over here, and then finally I come to one last piece, and I find it just doesn't work anymore. Somehow, what was designed to bond me together with another human being is no longer accomplishing what it was supposed to accomplish, because I have been bound and broken, bound and broken, bound and broken so many times that the mechanism no longer works the same. I don't want to scare you. What I know is that God has the capacity to, recreate our adhesive and to help us bond again together. I'm just saying that when we misuse the gift, some of the blessing of it is lost because it's no longer working in the way that God intended. All right, there's a whole host of other things we could say about this. I'd mentioned that there's all kinds of national studies that have shown that people who have waited to get, to be intimate until they finally got married actually have a greater stick-to-itiveness when it comes to the rest of their, their married life. They're less likely to end up seeing their marriage end in divorce. There's a whole lot of other reasons why we might recognize this is a good gift. I want to say this. For Levon and me, we got married pretty young and very young. And when we got married, I had never been with another woman in that way. And she'd never been with another man in that way. And so we're the only people we have ever slept with in our whole life. And what that has done is it creates a bond. And over the course of 40 years, so I told Levon this the other day, we were in a big event, and I said, I just want you to know, I look around this room, and I'm not scouting out, who there is beautiful or not, but I'm just like, I look in this room, and you're the most beautiful woman in this entire room. And she said, you need your eyes checked. There are a lot of prettier women than I am here. I said, not to me, because my heart, you are imprinted on my heart and on my mind. I am bound to you, and you are bound to me in a beautiful way, and in part because we have shared this gift for 40 years. That leads me to one last area of concern when it comes to intimacy, and that has to do with pornography. And so when we think about pornography, this is so ubiquitous in our world today. You have access to it in so many different places. And so you've got to ask the question, what's going to keep me from doing that? Why would I not be looking at this all the time? And especially, we find rising numbers of young women who are looking at pornography. But for men, this is something that we are hardwired and visual creatures, drawn to these things that you have access to with your phone or your iPad or your computer or whatever. So knowing that there's a part of us that longs for this, and then, that's our sex drive, and then we have the sin drive that tends to drive us towards doing the things we shouldn't do. The only thing that might restrain us from that is understanding that this isn't God's will for our lives. So why doesn't God want us to be looking at, pornographic images? And listen, again, tons of grace. I mean, my gosh, every human being I know, every man anyway, is drawn towards wanting to see these things. So God understands that, and there's a lot of grace there. But I'd like to, again, lift up to you, or for you, this ideal of what this should look like. Now, I want to start by looking to see how many people in our survey indicated that they had used pornography or viewed explicit material at least monthly. So this is at least monthly. And the blue is men, the red is women. And we start here in the 20s, and 8% of women. That's a huge increase from where we used to be 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. And for men, 42% in their 20s, 45%. So you see this huge number right here in the 20s through up to age 50. And then you find the numbers begin to drop off, and part of that's a decline in sexual drive, but part of that's also, maybe we've been around long enough to say, this isn't something I want to pursue on a monthly basis. I want to try not to do this. And we find later on, by the time you get to 90, not too many 90-plus-year-olds who are looking at porn today. So when we look at this, we realize this is a big issue. It's a huge issue, especially teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, and really on into the 50s and 60s. And so what's wrong with this? I mean, what's the big deal? And by the way, I would mention, you look at those numbers, you say, wow, Church of the Resurrection's got a real problem. Those numbers are lower than the national average for Christians across the country. Once more, I'm kind of proud of you because you come in below the national average when it comes to these kind of things. And I would hope that's because you have a deeper and growing faith and a call to follow Jesus that's really serious. And so, for any of us, it's that, we find that battle between our love for Jesus and our desire to please him and this thing that really, calls out to us. So Jesus calls us not to look with lust upon another, right? And he says adultery is not just what we do physically with our bodies, but what's going on in our hearts. The apostles call us regularly not to succumb to sexual immorality. So again, why not? So here's a few interesting facts. When we're engaged in porn and self-stimulation, what we find is that dopamine is released. That's the same hormone that's released during our physical intimacy with a mate. And so that can be very pleasurable, but it also can be addictive for us. And so often for many people, that self-stimulation and pornography becomes addictive. It becomes something that we don't want to give up. And then what you find is if this becomes a regular part of your life, you want to receive that same level of, that same hit, if you will, from dopamine. But over time, when you're doing something, again and again and again, you find you need more to stimulate the same level of dopamine to stimulate your brain. And so you go from soft porn to a little harder porn, to a little harder porn, to really hard porn, to illegal porn. And then somewhere along the way, maybe you end up deciding to act upon that. Now, I'm not saying everybody does this, but I am saying that there are a whole lot of people who have made horrible, sinful decisions when it came to sex and what they did with that. I had a friend who ended up in prison for this and ended up there, and he started here, and he went to here, and then to here, and then to here, until he finally starts doing things for which you get arrested for. And so, I don't want that for any of you. Neither does God. And then we find this thing that, once we're stimulated in this way, the real thing never quite adds up to what we see in the visual image because all that's fake. It's all pretend. And so we find whatever we're doing in reality never measures up to that. And we find this isn't even that stimulating anymore, the real thing. So this is a quote from neuroscientist Nicola Ray at Manchester Metropolitan University, who writes, porn works on the brain like any addictive substance. The thing you're addicted to takes hold of your neural circuitry and hijacks the pathways related to more natural rewards so they become unresponsive. So porn becomes the only thing the brain understands in relation to sexual stimulation. Basically, real sex becomes increasingly less exciting. Now that quote wasn't published in Christianity Today. That quote comes from Cosmopolitan magazine in the UK. Right? And what it's recognizing is the impact that porn can have on some people. Not everybody, but it certainly can have that impact on some people. And so, why do I not do cocaine? Even though it might make me feel euphoric for a little while. I've never touched it. Why would I not do it? Because I don't think that pleases God. And I think it could hurt me. Why would I decide to not engage in porn when I might really enjoy that? Well, because I think it might hurt me. It might hurt my relationship with Yvonne. It might end up, lessening the joy that I have with her. It's not that I wouldn't be drawn to that or you wouldn't be drawn to it. It's just saying, I'm going to work really hard. God, I need your help. And I'm going to try to walk in the right path and not do something that could hurt me in the end or hurt someone else. So Paul writes this to the little church at Thessalonica. He says, God's will is that your lives are dedicated to him. This means that you stay away from sexual immorality. The Greek word there is porne. That you stay away from sexual immorality and learn how to control your own body in a pure and respectable way. Don't be controlled by your sexual urges like the Gentiles who don't know God. No one should mistreat or take advantage of their brother or sister in this issue. All right, so that leaves me about 5 minutes to talk about the good side, the beautiful side of physical intimacy. We've already been talking about that when it comes to bonding and love, but this really is a key to making our relationships last for a lifetime. And it's also an area where there's a lot of pain and brokenness in relationships. So I want to share with you just a few other statistics and data from our poll here at Church of the Resurrection. This is our chart of married life, the people who are married, how long they've been married, and how many are very happy. So when we think about people who are very happy in marriage, we find that people start off in less than 5 years, their early years, 55% were very happy. This is resurrection people. And then it drops down dramatically, and we recognize that's when children come into the equation. And then maybe a second child, and we bottom out here in years 15 to 19, with only 34% of our people, just 1/3, saying they are very happy. Now, there's a big chunk that are also somewhat happy. And then we find maybe the first child moves out of the house and we find a little bit of happiness. Now, it's not that we're not happy in every other part of our lives. We love our kids. We love being around them. It's just that our relationship suffers. And then we find it drops down after the second child or the third child leaves home. And now we're empty nesters trying to learn to dance again. And then finally we find that our happiness goes up week after week or, year after year after year until we get to, in our 40 plus years of marriage, we're happier than we were when we were newlyweds. Some of you have kids graduating from high school, maybe your last child graduating from high school. Hey, it's going to be hard for a little while, and then it's going to get better and better and better. It's going to be very exciting. But when we think about, during this period of time, so if you bring this back up, during this period of time is also when we struggle the most. It's our most vulnerable period in our marriages. And we also find that's true when it comes to our intimate life. And so this is the data from the men who said, what does your mate do that you find irritating or leaves you feeling far from him or her? And for the men, we have the same chart for the women. What we find is in that same period of time, now these are guys in their 30s and 40s and on into the 50s, but it really peaks in the 40s, where you've got a couple of kids still at home perhaps, and your career's going like crazy and you're running a million miles an hour. And you find that this is where both the wife and the husband are not experiencing the intimacy they once had. They're too tired, they're emotionally spent, they haven't invested in developing their relationship, and so they find that this is where the frustration builds, and this is one of the dangerous periods in our lives. And what I've taught you before is that you hold on during this period of time because it's not gonna last forever, and there's certain things you can do, we're gonna talk about a little bit today, and especially next week, certain things you can do to counterbalance that and to ensure that you're having a deeply meaningful relationship even during the challenging times. So just because you see somebody at that time where you feel like, oh, they make my heart beat faster, it must be God's will that I'm with this person, like that's stupid. No, it just means you're a human being and you're struggling over here and you find over here seems fresh and new, and that's not God's will. That's just what happens as human beings. So I wanted to share with you a little more data, and that is how frequently are we as a congregation, 10,100 people who took the survey, how frequently are we actually intimate with each other? Because for a lot of people, they have expectations that are unrealistic, and then those unrealistic expectations lead to frustration. And so we all think, at least men, tend to think that everybody else is doing it more than we are. And so we asked you, how frequently are you intimate with your mate? And so this was a question to married people. And I'll just share this with you. And the lines are kind of confusing, but let me just try to make it clear. This is 5 years or less in marriage. This is over 50 years of marriage. And these lines, this red line means never. And this gray line right here means once a week, being intimate with each other. And this line right here means twice a week. And this line over here means 3 times a week. So I want you to notice that the twice a weeks, early in their marriage, that's about 34% of people were twice a week. And that means that everyone else was once a week. Everyone else was less than once a week. So 65% who were less than once a week married less than 5 years. And then, we go on and we find that begins to drop as children come into the equation, then children leave and that begins to go up. And then it slowly begins to decline, in this way. And we find that some people, many of us think, well, everybody must be twice a week, but we find that really even early in marriage, that's not a huge number. But by the time we get to, here 50 years of marriage and up, that's about 4% of people married 50 years who are twice a week. And I just want to know your secret, like, way to go. That's just awesome. But, that's not typical. That's like 96% of people are not with you. And then we go here to the, as we look at 3 times a week, and at 3 times a week, we're down to about 1% of people. So I want us to recognize that, this is more of the reality. Study after study after study that I found, including our own studies, showed that 1 time a week, so one researcher said it this way, 1 time a week is like optimal. Now, after 1 time a week, it increases satisfaction a little bit, but it's only incremental. Whereas, from going from less than 1 time to 1 time a week sees a pretty quantum jump, a big jump in satisfaction. Not everybody's the same. Not everybody wants 1 time a week. Some people say, I'm fine with no physical intimacy in a relationship. And so I want to show you that data too. So this is satisfaction with physical intimacy as it correlates to happiness in the marriage. So people who are in very happy marriages, 73% of them were also satisfied with the physical dimension of their relationship. People who were in struggling or very unhappy marriages, 71% were very unsatisfied in their physical dimension of their relationship. Here's the point. There is a connection. There is a correlation. It's chicken and the egg. We don't know which is which. But what we know is if we can improve the physical dimension of our relationship, it may just improve the happiness dimension of our relationship. If we can improve the happiness dimension of our relationship, we do those things that make our relationship closer, we might just improve the physical intimacy and our satisfaction in the physical intimacy in our relationship. These 2 things go hand in hand, and they can be improved. And there is hope. And probably most people are not doing it as often as you might think. All right, so just a couple of keys that might help you in terms of improving this part of your life. Obviously, doing all the things that help your spouse feel more loved. It's the affection that helps lead to the intimacy. So that's one thing. But I'd mention these 4 things. Make intimate time as fun and playful as possible. So this is fun. It's a gift from God. It's a blessing. It's supposed to be fun. So make it as fun as possible. Get enough sleep and have good hygiene. That's pretty simple. But we find that most of us are not that interested when we're too tired. And so figure out how do we make sure we get enough sleep, and doing simple things to make sure that we're taking care of our bodies and taking care of ourselves and brushing our teeth and all that kind of good stuff really helps. The third is to set date nights for making love. Now that may seem so counterintuitive to you, but here's what happens for a lot of people, men I think in particular, is they're wondering, is this the night where she's gonna be interested? Is this the night? And then he tries to move in that direction, and if she's not interested, then he feels disappointed and he goes and pouts. And then it happens again, and he's still trying to figure it out. And then after a while, you just feel this friction. But what would happen if you just said, hey, let's set a date night. Let's figure out, what day of the week that we're gonna get rest the night before, and we're gonna have a romantic evening, and we're gonna enjoy this time, and we're gonna get a babysitter or whatever you gotta do. But let's just plan it so we both know this is the time. And then by mutual agreement, we might say, well, let's move it to next Tuesday instead. That's okay. But at least you have some idea where you're going. And that tends to lead, for many people, to a better intimate life and a better and happier relationship. And then finally, affectionate talk and selfless touch. Right? All of these things help us to be able to find the kind of relationship that binds us together, that connects us, and that helps us have a love that lasts for a lifetime. In Scripture, physical intimacy is a gift from God. And it is a way of living out agape, selfless love for another human being. And it's part of the mission of marriage is to figure out how we bless one another and how we learn to dance in this area. And if we figure that out, and if we avoid all of the things that bring pain and heartache, we're gonna find our relationships not only last a lifetime, but they last a lifetime with joy. I'd like to invite you to bow with me in prayer if you would. And if you found yourself struggling in your relationship, maybe you've been involved in an affair, maybe you are right now. If you are right now, I'm just begging you, stop. Just stop. This is not God's will for your life. If you're involved in some form of intimacy that hurts other people, this is not God's will for your life. Stop. And for many of us, we're just involved in trying to live out our faith in some way, and at the same time struggling with our sexuality. I'd just like to invite you to be able to say, God, please forgive me for. If there's anything you need forgiveness for, this is a great time to ask. Why don't you just whisper that to God? God, you know all of our secrets, the things no one else knows. And you're a God of redemption and grace and mercy, and we thank you for that. Wash us clean and make us new. Make us sticky again, so that this good gift that you've given us works the way it's supposed to work. And guide us, we pray. And Lord, we pray that we might live a life of love and affection towards other people, that we might bless with our actions and with our words, and that you might bring healing and joy and happiness to our relationships, in particular to our romantic relationships. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you for watching this week's sermon. We'd love for you to join us again online or live in worship. To learn more about Church of the Resurrection, please visit core.org. Have a great week.